This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 444 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. FanDuel Sportsbook is giving users an opportunity to win big on this week's Thursday night football matchup between the Colts and the Titans. Right now, you have a chance to bet $5 on either the Colts or the Titans at plus 2,500 odds. And if you win, you'll make $125. You heard that correctly. Bet $5, win $125. The offer is for this Thursday's game only, so download the FanDuel Sportsbook mobile app, sign up, and make your first deposit to see your enhanced odds today. Must be 21 years or older, present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado, West Virginia, Tennessee, or Indiana. New users only. Must wager on designated boost market. Deposit required. Max bonus $125. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. Or in Tennessee, call Tennessee Redline at 1-800-889-9789. Let's get to these trends. So we know the tight end position is obnoxiously bad in fantasy football. One of the players who people are probably trotting out week in and week out because the position is so mediocre is Hunter Henry. I feel like Henry is looked at more favorably than his production is actually telling us. Or I guess what I'm saying is in fantasy football, he's kind of overrated when looking at production only. Despite Justin Herbert doing what he's doing, Henry has finished with just one top 10 tight end performance this year. He's outside the top 12 or tight end 1 territory in PPR points per game. The thing is, he's seeing decent volume with an 18% target share this year. And it's not like his other peripherals are totally horrendous. He's pretty average when it comes to average depth of target, and he has 5 end zone targets this year. That's tied for 9th across the league at the position. And according to Pro Football Focus, he's 7th in the NFL in routes run at the position. So I'd at least say that better days are ahead for Hunter Henry, given the competition that he has at tight end. The injuries to Julian Edelman and N'Keal Harry have allowed Jakobi Meyers to absolutely break out. Listen to these target shares that he's had over the last 3 weeks. 27.3%, 43.5%, and 41.1%. He's been the wide receiver 13 in PPR points per game over this time, but he hasn't found the end zone. Now, I didn't bring him up on yesterday's 15 transaction show because I brought him up in the previous week's show. I like to build off of each show. But he should be rostered in pretty much every single league. I can't imagine they send him back to the bench even when Edelman and Harry are healthy. Speaking of the Patriots, their passing touchdown numbers just keep getting more and more depressing. I mentioned last week how they have a really low pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. But that got even lower after their performance against the Jets. It's now a 0.23 ratio. When the team in second, the team with the second lowest ratio, it's Washington with a ratio of 1, meaning they have the same number of passing touchdowns as rushing touchdowns. The Patriots have thrown just 3 passing touchdowns to 13 rushing touchdowns this year. Since 2000, only 8 teams have thrown 3 or fewer passing touchdowns through week 9. And the Patriots are one of them. I know I sound a little bit like a broken record here, but we can't assume that this keeps up. Even during Monday night's game, you saw instances where the narrative could have been flipped. Like when Damiere Byrd almost scored a touchdown. It's true that the Patriots are run heavy. It's true that they're going to run Cam when they're close to the end zone. But it's those instances, those Damiere Byrd plays, where you know regression is a thing. Sometimes things go one way instead of the other. That's football. Trend 4 is that over the last 5 games, Nelson Agholor has ranked worse than wide receiver 34 in weekly scoring just once. Now, I do my weekly start-sit show on FanDuel's YouTube channel every Sunday at noon Eastern. And when doing it this past week, I got a whole lot of Nelson Agholor questions. He came through with a decent 13.5 PPR point performance, but once again, he didn't see a ton of work. In fact, despite his usable performances over the last month, during this 5-game stretch, he's had a target share in the double digits just once. He's averaged a 12.6% share per game. He's just living off of touchdowns, and that's why it's so difficult for me to recommend that you add him or that you play him in a given week. The Miami Dolphins have finished as a top 6 defense in 5 of their last 6 games. The only game where they didn't was against Seattle. This hasn't only been the result of touchdowns either. The Dolphins are averaging almost 3 sacks per game during this time frame, and they're now top half in the league in both sacks and pressure rate. It's also not just due to opponent. During this stretch, they faced the Rams and the Cardinals. But I will say, I do think in terms of fantasy scoring, which is what we're looking at here, the perfect storm has kind of hit. Miami had a defensive touchdown this past week. They wouldn't have been nearly as impactful against Arizona without that score. And they faced the Jets and the 49ers in between these games as well. So while it hasn't only been touchdowns and only been opponent, they've scored touchdowns against their tough opponents, and they've done well against their bad opponents. But let's give them some credit. They deserve some credit. They've been an awesome defense over the last month and a half. I don't think they're a plug-and-play defense in fantasy, but they've been great. Over the last 3 weeks, Curtis Samuel has averaged a 20.6% target share per game while also running the ball 7 times. During this same time period, DJ Moore's target share per game has been 16.1%. Samuel also leads the team in red zone targets during this time. He's being used more, and he's being used more in creative ways. He's definitely someone to roster, and he's still available in almost 70% of Yahoo leagues. You could easily argue that he's part of the reason that DJ Moore has been suffering too. So I send a chart out on Twitter every week that shows the positional target shares by team. This week, I decided to look at the target shares for each team from weeks 1 through 4, and then from weeks 5 through 9. And then from there, I found the difference. So in other words, the new chart shows how much of a target share change each team has seen by position over the last 5 weeks of football. One of the glaring results in doing that was seeing how from weeks 1 through 4 versus weeks 5 through 9, Minnesota's really started to target their tight ends more. They've seen an increase in tight end target share in this split of almost 10%. And this past week, both Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph had 20% target shares. Now, digging deeper into this, Irv has now run 11 more routes than Kyle Rudolph over this time, from weeks 5 through 9. From weeks 1 through 4, the difference was just 1. So we're seeing a slight change in not only how the Vikings are using Irv Smith, but also how frequently they're targeting tight ends in general. I'd argue this is more regression than anything else, because they really weren't targeting their tight ends at a high rate to start the year, but it's something to understand for when you're streaming tight ends. Something else that I wanted to point out from that chart was how much more Washington is targeting their running backs. From weeks 1 through 4, their running back target share was just under 21%. From weeks 5 through 9, that shot up to over 35%. That's insane. Alex Smith targeted J.D. McKissic at a super high rate on Sunday, which is something that I talked about on yesterday's show. But keep in mind, too, that in Alex Smith's debut back in week 5, Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissic in that game combined for a 46% target share. There's absolutely some noise to this. Game script probably is impacting the dump-off numbers. But I don't think that it's completely meaningless. It's why McKissic was featured as an ad this week. Drew Lock hasn't had a single game this season where he threw the ball 15-plus air yards at a rate lower than 15%. So a 15% deep ball rate has been his minimum this season. That's the highest minimum among relevant quarterbacks. And on the season, Ryan Tannehill, Drew Brees, Daniel Jones, and Cam Newton, they have a deep ball rate under that 15% mark. So their average across the season is lower than Drew Lock's single game minimum. This obviously doesn't make or break a quarterback as being good or bad in fantasy football. But like we saw last week against Atlanta, when Denver's in a plus matchup, it can do good things not just for Lock as a streamer, but as pass catchers too, even if a lot of production comes from garbage time. The last trend this week is something that I briefly mentioned on yesterday's 15 Transactions episode, but Antonio Brown led the Buccaneers in air yards against the Saints. He also had just 1 fewer target than Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, despite running 7 fewer routes than Godwin and 5 fewer routes than Evans. And keep in mind, this was obviously his first game back. Now, I think Brown has the most potential of the 3 wide receivers on that team moving forward. By potential, I'm talking upside. But there's clearly tons of risk, and I think straight up, Godwin is the safest choice with the best expected value because of that risk. But like I said yesterday, given the way that the market probably views things, AB might be the best buy among the group. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly matchup show.